but for this conversation that I know I'm going to learn a ton, but I want to tell a little bit of the history of how we got here. When you're talking about issues related to the African American community in February, I think there's a temptation to assume that this is just what members of Congress do during Black History Month. This conversation's really about 9 months in the making. It started after the George Floyd murder and the protest that followed. The last conversation I had with my friend and colleague John Lewis was as the protests were striking out across the nation. John said, his first comment, he said, "I thought we were done with this. I thought that the issues in my youth were behind us right now." And if anybody's ever heard John Lewis talk, he never ends on a down note. And then he said, "But I've never been more optimistic in my life because I have never seen so many people who don't look like me standing up and getting engaged in fighting for civil rights." And there was something just beautiful. And I think we all saw it in this district. I certainly did in the events I went to in Barrington and Wheaton and Downers Grove, of this huge diversity of people standing up and caring, and people who, are from different communities, different colors, different socioeconomic backgrounds, but they got up and got involved. And we're not perfect. We're not all as woke as we think we are. But the value of that moment, I think it only counts if it continues. And it was my great pleasure in the course of walking down the streets of Downers Grove to have this rather tall fellow come up behind me and said, your parents said I should talk to you. And that was Carvel Massendown was here, and then introduced me to his friend Tandra. And we had a number of conversations, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't think I'm misrepresenting what you said to say we need to have a larger conversation about the fact that it is not as easy to be a middle-class African American in a middle-class white town as people think. But to have that conversation requires confronting some things that are unpleasant. And that led to saying, okay, well, how can we have that conversation in some fashion? And this is going to be the first of a couple events. We're going to conclude in March with an event with my good friend Terry Sewell. But that conversation really led to discovering for me Richard Rothstein, who wrote this book, The Color of Law, which I'd recommend everybody. And I've described the book to people as I sort of feel the way reading this as I did after I read The Warmth of Other Suns. I just feel embarrassed because there's so many parts of our history that I didn't know and should have known. And so we're going to, start with a bit of a conversation with Richard and Carvel and Tandra, and then get to your questions. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat. And I guess I'll take a congressional privilege and start with a sort of an open-ended question for you, Richard. And it's a very personal question for me, but it's very specific. I moved here in 2007. I had two girls. One of them was not quite a year old. One of them was just about to turn 3. We moved from the East Coast, and I was a middle-class white dude. So we did what middle-class white families do. We looked for a town with good schools, good access to rail, good access to O'Hare, a nice downtown. I really wanted to live in a place that was diverse because I'd grown up in New York and sort of valued the diversity of the town I grew up in. And it turned out that if I wanted diversity, I couldn't get those other 3, unless I lived in Oak Park. Oak Park was probably the only place that you could get all those together. And so we moved to Downers Grove, and it's a great town. Explain for me and for us how it is that if you want good schools, and if you want a nice downtown, and if you want a nice commute, you've got to trade that against diversity in the Chicago suburbs.
Well, thank you. And thank you for engaging in this discussion with me. But let me challenge, if I may, one of the assumptions that were implicit in your question. And that is, what do you mean by a good school? To me, a good school is a school with a diverse student population that prepares students to live in a diverse society. A good school is not necessarily a school where the test scores are highest. What social scientists know is that what test scores reflect primarily is not the quality of a school, but the educational level, the social class of the parents. And one of the things, I'm actually working with the National Association of Realtors now to try to get the real estate industry off this notion that you can identify a high quality community by the test scores of their schools, because that's not a good reflection of the schools. So many of the children who come to schools in a place like Downers Grove would have high test scores if they haven't went to school at all. They'd have high test scores from the conversations they have at the dinner table with their parents. They'd have high test scores because of the reading and the extra activities they get in after school and summer activities. So I think you do have to make trade-offs. There's no question about it. But I hope that someday we will be able to teach people that if you want to prepare for life in the 21st century, a good school is not an all-white school.
So totally fair criticism, and I maybe gave the shorter version of that question. The town I grew up in New York was one of the one of the first towns to mandate busing in Westchester County, and as a result, it was an extremely diverse school. It was a school that became darker and darker skinned as I went from first grade to 12th grade. And I wouldn't trade it for the world, because it's an experience that when I left that moment, I want to say the choices, but the reality is that you roll down the hill and you end up in these sorts of places. That diversity isn't there anymore. So let me maybe reframe the question of, can you give our audience a little history of how it is that single family homes in the suburbs came to be the province of middle class white people, and multifamily homes in the inner city came to be more minority driven?
Sure, that's a different question, and let me address that, if I may. And as you know, the theme of the writings I've been doing, including that book, is that the widespread notion that we all share, that we have something called de facto segregation, where, as you describe, the suburbs are overwhelmingly white, single-family homes. Urban areas are overwhelmingly African-American or Hispanic and multifamily homes. And that happened by accident, is the way we believe it. We call it de facto segregation. That just sort of happened. And the theme that I've been writing about is that that's utter nonsense. The reason we have the segregation that you just described is because of a series of racially explicit government policies that violated the Constitution of the United States, that imposed segregation on our every metropolitan area in this country. You know, I've lived in many metropolitan areas. I also grew up in New York. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were white, like the Chicago area, clearly defined areas that were African-American. The whites were single-family home communities, middle class. That was created by the federal government. That didn't just happen. In the post-World War II period, millions of returning war veterans came home needing housing. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration embarked on a program to move those white, mostly working class, middle class families into single family homes in all white suburbs and prohibit African American returning war veterans from doing the same. These communities exist in every metropolitan area of the country. They exist in Chicago. They exist in New York. The one nearest to where I grew up was Levittown, east of New York City. It's probably the most famous of them because it was the largest, 17,000 homes in one place. Levitt was a bigot. He wouldn't have sold a home to an African American if given the choice. But he couldn't do this on his own. He went to bank after bank. Nobody would lend him the money to build and buy the land and build that development of 17,000 homes. The only way he could build it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the project, and asking for a federal bank guarantee for his loans. And the only way he could get that federal bank guarantee is if the federal government required him never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt and all of these other builders in Chicago and everywhere else. And I'm working with a lot of groups in the Chicago area now, identifying the builders and the banks that finance these, but they all had federal bank guarantees. The only way they could get them was by promising never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and many of these other developers to include a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And on that basis, the white suburbs were created and African Americans were excluded from them. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the FHA or VA. It was a written policy of the federal government, a blatant violation of the Constitution.
And why did the federal government take that decision? What was their stated logic for that decision?
They didn't have any stated logic. The Democratic Party, which was a party of economic benefits and racial segregation, not just in the South, but in the North, in the Midwest. They had a manual that they distributed. The FHA had a manual they distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend for federal bank guarantees these loans for developers like Levitt and all the others. The manual explicitly said that you could not guarantee a federal bank loan to a developer who was going to sell a home to an African American. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who would build an all-white project that was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. And we all go around believing this notion of de facto segregation, that it just sort of happened naturally and by accident. This is a federally constructed segregated system we have in blatant violation of the Fifth Amendment. Now, let me, if I may, Sean, let me go back to the specific question: is why did they do that? You said logic. There was no logic to it. And I tell this story in The Color of Law, and maybe you remember it, but in 1913, Woodrow Wilson was elected president of or took office as president of the United States. He was the first outwardly segregationist Democratic president to take office since the Civil War. And he embarked on a program. This is 1913. This is not right after the Civil War. It's 60 years after the end of the Civil War. He embarked on a program for the first time to segregate the federal civil service. And federal office buildings, starting in the Wilson administration, had to put up curtains that separated black and white clerical workers. African-American civil servants were fired from federal departments if they supervised whites, because that was no longer permitted. Federal departments had to set up separate washing facilities in basements for the African-American clerical workers, civil servants. Well, one of the largest federal departments at that time was the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. We didn't have a giant federal government then, but one of the largest departments was the Navy Department. And the official who was responsible for segregating the Navy Department was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913?
Is that FDR?
Yeah, it was FDR. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, you know, so you're asking, why did the New Deal and the Fair Deal impose segregation? It was the culture of the Democratic Party. It wasn't a Southern requirement. It was the culture of the National Democratic Party. And if you'll forgive me to do a little bit more history with you, you know, in 1932, when Roosevelt was first elected, African Americans overwhelmingly voted for Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate, not for Roosevelt. By 1936, when Roosevelt ran for re-election for the first time, African Americans overwhelmingly flipped and voted for Roosevelt. Why did they vote for Roosevelt? Well, for the Republicans, they got non-segregated, no benefits. Under the Democrats, they got housing, they got employment, all on a segregated basis. And African Americans chose that if they had to choose between no benefits at all and benefits with segregation, they would take the benefits with segregation. But this is the 20th century history of the Democratic Party. It really didn't change until Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson, of course, knew that by adopting a policy of integration, he was going to, in the not too long run, propel the leaving of white segregationists from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, we've lost the South for the generation. Wasn't that his line when he said it?
Well, we're getting it back though.
Carvel and Tandra, this is, you know, at least for our younger viewers, some of these things sound like ancient history. I want to turn the floor over to you for some questions, but talk about what's happened in your experience since the Civil Rights Act was passed. I'm assuming, Richard, that you're not going to tell us that everything was hunky-dory after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and now it's all kumbaya.
That's a fair assumption.
Well, I think one of the comments
Well,
that
go ahead, Carvel.
I would like to say that I think with the younger generation that, you know, it's systemic racism that has been the buzzword since the George Floyd incident, murder, however you want to call it. And so, you know, we just look back that housing and the systemic racism that segregated Black and white people, or people of color and white people, was to know that was instituted by our government is something that's just, you know, just it's blows my mind, even mine at 56 years old now. And I know that the concern now is that understanding what took place and how it has affected every part of our lives, education, the criminal justice system, everything has been affected by
generational wealth transfers.
By all means, and which is very much noted in Mr. Rothstein's book and in his conversations that he's had, that, you know, the wealth gap definitely was started right there, and it's something that we've never been able to, and even to this day, I don't see any way of that being changed. And that's what we want to try to get to some type of solutions, or what things are being done from a government, federal government, state government, and local government standpoint to change what has happened in the past.
Let me make a comment about that, if I may. You know, Sean referred before to John Lewis being very optimistic. I am too. So long as we believe that this all happened naturally and by accident, it's very hard to figure out how it can unhappen naturally and by accident. Once we realize that the racial inequality that is primarily supported by segregation, residential segregation, was the result of explicit public policy, it's much easier to understand that it can be reversed by explicit public policy. It's not it's not a mystery how to do that. We know how to do it. What we need is a new civil rights movement, like the one that John Lewis led, in order to create the pressure to enact the policies to reverse this. But it can be reversed just as easily as it was created. And if we do have that new civil rights movement, I'm hopeful that we can begin for the first time to make progress. John Lewis was right. We had 20 million Americans participating in those Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and they were led by African Americans, but most of the participants were white. It was the first time in American history that anything like that had happened. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow today in America than we ever have had before in American history. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. Who could have believed that 10 years ago, that that could be happening? I'm old enough to see that I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but I'm old enough to have seen changes that were inconceivable when I was young. Positive changes. Not all the changes have been positive. Some have been negative. Mass incarceration is a step backwards.
Definitely.
But you know, I lived in Chicago when I was young, and 60 years ago, I worked as a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And you're all from Chicago or the Chicago area. One of my jobs at the Chicago Urban League was to identify all of the policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago. Everything from the executive suite to things like personnel director, that's what we called human resource people in those days, you know, shipping and receiving directors, that kind of thing. And there was no internet, so we had these giant manuals that listed every company in Chicago and the phone number of every official. And I had to count them all up. There were 4,000 policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago. I think this was 1964 when I did this. Of those 4,000 policy-making positions, here's another quiz for you. How many of those do you think were African-American in 1964? Chicago has an African-American population of roughly about 35, 40% at that time. How many do you think were African-American of those 4,000 policy-making positions? Take a guess.
I'd say less than 5%.
Well, you're certainly right. How much less?
0.
0 is right. There wasn't a single, not a single African-American in a corporation in Chicago higher than the level of shipping and receiving director. Now, if someone had told me in 1964, or told, actually I was too young to really appreciate the significance of that, but told my research director that within 10 years, you couldn't have a corporation in Chicago without a diverse executive suite, he would have said, you're crazy. That can't happen. That can't happen in your lifetime. But we saw it, and we saw it because there was a civil rights movement that made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation in that sector, and in public accommodations, and in public transportation.
If you're thinking about legal changes, one of the comments you made in your book that troubled me as a legislator, because it's so darn hard to fix, is, and I'm going to misquote you, but it said, you know, when you desegregate a lunch counter, the lunch counter is desegregated the next day. When you desegregate the rules on housing, it takes a generation, it takes home buyers, and of course, in that duration, you may get a different mayor of the next cycle who's a little less enlightened, or a different planning commission. And are there examples you've seen of communities that have made the transition and made it in a durable way that doesn't have people moving into a community who all of a sudden have to move out before they've paid off down any of the equity in their house?
Well, Oak Park is one example of a place that's tried to do it better than other places. It hasn't been totally successful, but it's been reasonably successful. Mount Airy, an area in Philadelphia, is another one of that kind. Cleveland Heights outside Cleveland is another. There are many communities that have taken small steps to stabilize desegregation, to prevent the community from flipping from one form of segregation to another form of segregation. But they're small steps. And if we understand that this segregation was created unconstitutionally, in violation of the civil rights of African Americans, it wasn't de facto, it didn't happen by accident. If we understand that, then we also understand that as American citizens, we have an obligation, if there's a civil rights violation, to remedy it. And we can take much more aggressive steps to remedy it than the small steps that have been taken by some communities around the country. For example, and I'm not suggesting that this is something that Congress can do now, because we don't have a civil rights movement that's going to force you to do it. But for example, we should have an affirmative action program in housing. The federal government should be buying up homes at market rates in communities that were created on an all-white basis when they were affordable to African Americans, and which are now unaffordable to them. The federal government should be buying up homes at market rates in those communities and reselling them to African Americans at deeply discounted prices. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And the only thing that's preventing us from doing it is political will. It's not technically impossible to figure out how to do that. And so if we have a new civil rights movement that emerges out of those 20 million people, I think it's conceivable that we can do things like that. We're taking small steps around the country. As you may know, the city of Minneapolis prohibited single-family zoning citywide a year and a half ago. The state of Oregon has done the same thing. That's not enough to desegregate those communities. You need additional race-conscious policies to take advantage of that upzoning in order to ensure that the duplexes and the triplexes are not simply gobbled up by wealthier tech workers and others who can afford them. But it's a step in the right direction. We have communities that, in addition to abolishing single-family zoning, are doing a better job of inclusionary zoning in various parts of their community. Montgomery County, for example, which is a wealthy suburb outside Washington, Maryland, has a program where any new development has to include 15% of its units that are affordable for moderate income families. And then the Public Housing Authority of Montgomery County purchases 1/3 of that 15% as public housing units in the middle of an affluent market rate development. So there are models around the country of things that can be done on a small scale, and they can be magnified many times if we have the political will to do it.
Tandra, I think I
So
talked over you. What's on your mind? And I
Yeah,
apologize.
yeah. No, that's okay. I can sit and listen to Richard. I think we're all getting schooled right now. So thank you for sharing your knowledge. But a couple of things. Sean, I want to go back to something you said in the opening when you talked about how relocating here and this notion of being in a neighborhood with good schools. And I know Richard has already addressed that. But I want to go back to it because it relates to me, right? And when I moved here to Illinois and I moved in Downers Grove, and the district that you represent is largely homogeneous. And the school, the high school that my son would be going to was even more homogeneous. One of the decisions that I made to move from one side of Downers Grove to the other side was because there were other communities that had more diversity that fed into the high school. So while you were making that decision and what constituted good schools, what Richard is saying is very true. And it is how I have navigated my life with my children and trying to ensure that they are in an environment that is rich and diverse. And so I just wanted to comment on that conversation earlier. But I wanted to go back to Richard, if I could. You mentioned zoning policies and ordinances. I live and work in two racially different communities, one white and one Black, one highly resourced with grocery stores and restaurants and shopping centers, and I don't have to travel too far to get anything that I need, and another with fast food restaurants, liquor stores, and maybe one grocery store. Can you talk a little bit more about how, city ordinances and zoning policies have created and perpetuate these types of disparities?
Yes, there are so many policies, racially explicit policies that governments at all levels followed to create the segregation that we know. One of them is, as you mentioned, zoning. And I'm not just talking now about single family zoning, but in many metropolitan areas, Chicago among them. I've written in detail about St. Louis in this respect. Zoning commissions permitted polluting industries, toxic waste dumps to be placed in communities where African Americans lived. That was one of the ways in which they decided where to permit industry to be located. And then it worked in the other direction too. In those communities, in many of those areas, the only places where African Americans could find housing that was open to them was in communities that were zoned industrial or semi-industrial. And this was a practice that was followed all over the country. It wasn't racially explicit as the 20th century moved on. It was just done that way. But the dog whistles, the racially implicit motivations are easy to uncover when those were done. And this was another aspect of zoning that, as you said, has created this disparity.
Yeah.
How does
And just
that lead to the differential retail outlets though that Tandra is talking about? How does that lead to the one town has the Whole Foods and the other one has the liquor store?
Well, it has it because you've concentrated the most low-income families in a single place, which can't support higher value retail stores. If we had an integrated community where people of different income levels all live together, the retail would be appealing to them in all those communities. If you concentrate the lowest income people in one place, that's where the predatory retailers are going to locate.
Richard, I just was thoroughly impressed with your response regarding your comment, I guess I should say, of how we could look at, the government buying up homes and selling them to Black families in the suburbs. And it just doesn't seem that hard to me. And don't consider myself a very bright person by any stretch of the imagination. But to me, and I don't know that government can do this, maybe this is a question for Rep. Casson as well, is if we have manufacturing and jobs put back into the inner cities where money can be made so that we can improve our wealth to better our lives, to allow for grocery stores and certain retail to come into our communities. Again, this kind of sounds like to me, which everybody seems to have a hard time. Reparations is not something that can be given, even though it's been given to other nationalities. It cannot be given to African Americans who it's been proven that we were bought over here as slaves, as free working people that did not receive any of the benefits of the work that they had accomplished. So I guess it doesn't seem that hard to me that we can't, but again, it all comes down to the white privilege accepting and acknowledging these disastrous things that have been done to a group of people. Sean, what can we do? What is being done now, and what can we do to say, hey, you can't change human nature and what people think, but how can we got to do something. It's got to be something that can be done to rectify this.
So,
and Sean, before you jump in, I just want to say, Sean, that that is a question that many constituents have asked. That was probably the most popular question that was submitted around reparations and reparations around housing, being an area that where reparations could be applied in a useful way. So I just wanted to let you know that was a question that a number of viewers asked about and submitted prior to our discussion tonight.
So let me take a crack at this and then turn over with a question for Richard that I think he's a better scholar of the law than I am. I'm just a chemical engineer who pretends to write laws. First, and I come back to how this conversation started, that for us to get through this is Carvel and Tandra, you pointed out, we got to have some uncomfortable conversations, and we've got to acknowledge that we have never really reconciled our original sin as a country, and we haven't because it's hard. It contradicts the decency we think we have, and even if we say it's our founders, it goes into there. The civil rights era undid some of it, You know, when we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that banned chokeholds and all sorts of other practices, we had a discussion about whether we should include more comprehensive criminal justice reform, and felt that that was probably a bit of a political bridge too far in the moment. I'm not proud of that, but there is the political constraints. The bill that's been around for a long time that I've co-sponsored last term, I've co-sponsored again this term. I think it's HR 40. I think I believe Barbara Lee is now carrying it. It was John Conyers' bill before he died. It was the bill to create a commission to study and recommend a process of reparations, not to pay reparations, but essentially to start the conversation, with the idea being that if you acknowledge that after we made slavery illegal with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and all those reforms, and then we passed the Homestead Act to create a bunch of wealth for white families, promised African American families 40 acres and a mule, and then left them with what's Martin Luther King's line of the cruel irony of telling a man to lift himself up by his bootstraps after you've taken away his boots. And to the extent that that bill can be passed and signed into law, we can then at least start to grapple with what is the size of our sin. And if we can acknowledge the size of our sin, then we can start to talk about, do we have the political will to deal with it? But we haven't even taken that first step yet to acknowledge the size of the sin. And I want to take it to turn this back to Richard. I think one of the most powerful and, in a political sense, most dangerous ideas in your book is that it's not de facto, it's de jure. Because if it's de jure segregation, then we are admitting that government was complicit, and we are admitting that government has a responsibility and an obligation to correct. And Richard, if you could walk through for our lay audience what those terms mean, and in a constitutional sense, what are the practical consequences of us admitting as a nation that you're right?
Well, there's a lot of things I'd like to respond to in the last couple of comments. I'll start with your last one and just briefly summarize that. I think I said a little bit of this before, but so long as we believe that racial segregation happened naturally, it happened because of private bigotry, it happened because businesses like banks and real estate agencies and developers were bigoted and wouldn't sell or market homes to African Americans, but private businesses, not government, or believe that people just like to live with each other of the same race and we feel more comfortable that way, or believe that the reason we have segregation is because of economic differences. These are all private sector activities, and under our constitutional system, as we now understand it, if something happened in the private sector without government involvement, the government is very limited in what it can do to fix it. But if we understand, and that's what we call de facto segregation, it's just happened in fact, not in law. If we understand, on the other hand, that the reason we're a segregated society, an apartheid society really, is because of public policy that was racially explicit, such as the one I described before, and I can describe many, many others. If we understand that the reason we're segregated is because of public policy, government rules, regulations, ordinances, laws, that's a constitutional violation. It's a blatant constitutional violation. If the federal government was creating segregation, as in that example I gave you before about the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, that's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. If local governments were doing it, state governments are doing it, it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. And we, all of us as American citizens, have an obligation to remedy it. That's, you use the term, it's less common than de facto segregation, but you use the term, and it's an accurate one, for state-sponsored segregation, the de jure segregation. That's what we've got. The segregation of metropolitan areas, residential segregation, is as unconstitutional as the legal segregation of schools that Brown versus Board of Education outlawed. It's as unconstitutional as the segregation of trains and buses that was ended in the civil rights era. And so we have an obligation as American citizens, all of us, to remedy it. So that's the first point. Let me make another point, particularly about something that Carvel said, because I want to make this point, and perhaps you'll disagree with it. I don't use the term white privilege. I don't think there's very much white privilege involved here. When white returning war veterans who had no housing in the post-World War II housing shortage were given mortgages for single-family homes. They were tiny working class homes. Levittown, the example I used before, 750 square feet. They sold for $8,000 a piece. It's $100,000 in today's money. When those returning war veterans were given those homes, that was an economic right. That wasn't a privilege. Every American should have a right to decent housing. Instead of calling it a privilege, we should be focusing on the fact that African Americans were denied that right. Not that other people got the right, which they should have had. Everybody should have had that right. And I think we elevate it too high if we call it a privilege. It's something that we all should be entitled to. Every American, black, white, Hispanic, should have that right and not consider it an unfair privilege. So far as the reparations bill goes, H.R. 40 now, it's an interesting bill. I actually haven't read the Barbara Lee version of it, but I read that
Sheila Jackson Lee. I'm being corrected by my staff that I confused
okay.
two dear friends, so I apologize to.
All right. Well, I haven't read the new version of it, but I did read the John Conyers version, which was introduced year after year and year. Its title was reparations. If you read it, nowhere in the text of the bill does the word reparations appear. What the bill is about is remedies, which is a much more powerful term in my view than reparations. Reparations, a single monetary payment, which would inevitably be token, would never solve this problem in a single generation, but what it would do would be convince many Americans that we've now taken care of the problem, we should move on and not worry about inequality anymore. We need policies that are much more drastic than reparations. The one I talked about before, about the federal government having an affirmative action program in housing. That would cost more than reparations in any conceivable amount. But there are many policies that we should be enacting that are cost-free, that are free, don't cost a penny, but that are quite radical because there's no political support for them now. We talked before about the abolition of single-family zoning. Doesn't cost a thing to do that, to open up communities to townhouses, to garden apartments, to duplexes, triplexes that can be affordable with some additional affirmative action subsidy to working class, middle class African Americans. It doesn't cost anything to abolish those zoning laws. Doesn't cost anything to stop using the federal programs that subsidize low-income families to reinforce segregation. The biggest program that the federal government now has to support the housing of low-income families is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which is a subsidy of the Treasury Department that's given to developers through state governments to build housing for low-income families. The Treasury Department regulations for this program place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Doesn't cost anything to change that, to reverse it. It's not that we shouldn't be building better housing in low-income neighborhoods. Of course we should, but we shouldn't only be building better housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should be building more housing that lower-income families, disproportionately African-American and minority, can live in high-opportunity communities, in places where there are good jobs, where there's transportation to get to those jobs, where there are schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their students, where there are grocery stores we talked about before that sell fresh food, and where there's clean air. We should be building affordable housing projects there as well. and the Treasury Department regulations say we shouldn't. The same thing is true of the Section 8 program that I'm sure you're familiar with. Excuse me. It's a subsidy for low-income families to help them to afford apartments that are otherwise beyond their reach. It reinforces segregation today because so many landlords refuse to accept Section 8 vouchers if they are in white segregated communities. And so the only place that most Section 8 voucher holders can use their vouchers is in low-income communities, reinforcing their segregation. If I may tell you one more anecdote, and then I'll stop running my mouth. I apologize, but old men like to talk about the old days. So I'll tell you something else I did in Chicago in the 1960s. I don't know if you remember the Robert Taylor homes, high-rises, public housing. Well, when I was working for the Chicago Urban League as a researcher, the Chicago Urban League had a lawsuit that it supported against the Chicago Housing Authority, again, for de jure segregation, for placing housing projects for African Americans, segregated projects for African Americans in Black neighborhoods, and segregated projects for whites in white neighborhoods. In those days, whites lived in public housing too, until they were all moved to the suburbs by that program I talked about before. And we pursued that suit and won. The Supreme Court upheld a lower court decision. You may be familiar with it. It's called the Gautreaux suit, Gautreaux, and it ordered the Chicago Housing Authority to stop segregating its housing. In response, President Nixon canceled the public housing program and said you have to issue Section 8 vouchers instead. But the settlement of that Gautreaux suit gave Section 8 voucher holders a premium to be able to afford apartments in high opportunity neighborhoods. It wasn't a big program, but that's what we should be doing everywhere, so that the Section 8 program does not reinforce segregation. So there are many policies that we should follow. And if we focus on reparations, I think we miss some of the much more powerful things that we should be doing in order to redress segregation.
Well, the sign that this is an interesting conversation is that none of us want to stop asking you questions, and the Q&A chat keeps filling up. So Tanner and Carvel, I'm told that you are deputized to go through there, and if you could, let's turn over and see what's in the queue.
Well, you've answered a lot of questions, but there are a few that we want to highlight. And one of them, if we all recall last year, President Trump fanned the flames of racism when he spoke to white middle-class women about saving their neighborhood, right? He played on, as we know, decades of racist fears and state-sanctioned segregation. You've already talked about how we got here, but this is a two-part question. You talk about block busting, so can you describe very specifically what block busting is and how it fueled and perpetuated racism and segregation and the beliefs about what will happen when Black people move into homogeneous white communities? And then one of our constituents asked, have there been any changes in housing policy since President Biden took office, and what more needs to be done? I know so that was a two-part question.
Oh, give the guy a break. He's only been there for a month. Less than that. Well, maybe 2 days more than that. Well, let me first talk about blockbusting. There's a myth that property values decline if African Americans move into a neighborhood. I know I like to use this word myth, but we have so many of them. But the opposite is actually true. Because African Americans in the 20th century had so many fewer housing options than whites, so much housing was not open to them, they had a shortage of supply. It was a simple supply-demand proposition. And if a white homeowner in a suburb near Chicago or an outlying area of Chicago wanted to move for whatever reason, maybe he got a job somewhere else, maybe he had a bigger family and wanted a bigger house, whatever the reason might be. If a white homeowner wanted to move, it was to that homeowner's advantage to sell to an African American, not to a white, because an African American would pay more for the same housing than a white would pay, simply because whites had many more choices of where they could live. So if African Americans moved into a community, property values increased. They didn't decline. And the Federal Housing Administration, which propagated this myth, was fully aware of the research that documented that property values increased. Well, what happened? Well, once African Americans moved in small numbers to a community, a previously all-white community, for reasons I said, a white homeowner wanted to sell for whatever reason, and it was to his advantage to sell to a black family. Speculators came into that community, frequently real estate agents, and my emphasis always, as I mentioned before, on the unconstitutionality of our segregation, because these real estate agents were, of course, all licensed by state government. And if a state government was fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities, this practice would have ended. But these real estate agents came into a community, began to try to panic white homeowners with this myth that their property values were going to decline because African Americans were moving in. And in my book, I describe one real estate agent, one speculator who bragged about how when he thought he could flip a community, he organized burglaries in the community. The real estate agent did, to persuade homeowners that their community was going to turn into a crime-ridden place. He hired African-American women to walk through the neighborhood pushing baby carriages, just to try to convince people that their neighborhood was changing very fast. He hired young black men to drive through the neighborhood with their radios blasting in a convertible, all preying to racial stereotypes. Well, what he was able to do at that point was get white homeowners who were panicked to sell to him at below market rates, market values, which of course was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their property values were declining, but then he would turn around and resell it to an African American at above market rates. So that was called blockbusting. I mentioned before that one of the communities that tried to do a better job, and with some success, is in your area. It's Oak Park. And to prevent this kind of thing, one of the things that Oak Park did was it prohibited lawn signs from being put up in front of homes when homes were for sale, to avoid the impression that the community was unstable. They implemented a very, very creative program of insurance against property value decline. The community had an insurance program to insure white homeowners that if they remained, they wouldn't lose their property value because they had an insurance program against it. And that stemmed white flight. But in the absence of those kinds of programs, the blockbusters, these real estate agents were able to flip a community from all white to all black. And once they did that, African Americans began to move in who couldn't really afford the kinds of prices that they had. They subdivided their homes in order to be able to make payments on the rent. The homes, the neighborhoods began to deteriorate. But this was all, could not have happened without government support. As I said, there was one case I describe in the book where this was in California, where a community was undergoing this kind of blockbusting practice. It was actually led by the president of the California Real Estate Board, the leading realtor in the state of California. And when community activists protested to the state licensing board, the state licensing board said this was none of their concern. So if the state licensing board had taken action against this realtor for this kind of exploitation, it would have stopped overnight. And the same thing is true in communities all over the country.
Yeah, I want to just touch the couple things of the Biden administration. The answer is not much yet because of course we got to do legislation, but there have been some executive orders issued which were largely undoing prior Trump executive orders, lowering the burden of proof to prove a discrimination case. The he has stated as a part of his agenda, and you will like this, Richard, that what he wants to do is to ban exclusionary zoning. That's actually an explicit part of President Biden's housing agenda. So some of that is in there. I think probably the most substantive near-term issue is the bill that we will vote on this week, because there is a huge mortgage and foreclosure crisis coming from folks who have not been able to pay their rents. A lot of the circumstances that you described, Richard, and hopefully you realize I was joking when I said it's all kumbaya since the civil rights era. If you look at what happened after the 2008 housing crisis, a lot of these same predatory lending practices have continued to cause African American families to, all else equal, same income level, same reimbursement risk, to have a higher mortgage rate, more subprime. And so as we get to a position where there is this deepening unemployment in the country, jobs are out, the folks who are most likely to lose their homes are the folks who are closest to that economic edge right now. So the president's push and the bill that we will pass this week in the House to extend the moratorium on evictions to give us a little bit more time to recover doesn't fix it, but at least keeps it from getting much worse. Because once you get into that cycle of homelessness and poverty, it's hard to get out of it.
Very much so. Rep. Caston, I have a question from Debbie, and she asked if you will co-sponsor the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And another constituent asks, how will federal, state, and local governments and nonprofits be empowered to fully enforce the Fair Housing Act?
So with respect to the bill, I don't know the bill off the top of my head, but please make sure to follow up with staff and hold us accountable, and we'll do some research and circle back with you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the second half of that question. How will all levels of government enforce the Fair Housing Act?
Yes, be empowered to enforce the Fair Housing Act. Yes.
I guess Richard, I'd ask you for your guidance on what you'd recommend. Housing is not my area of expertise, and I'd rather admit that than pretend to know better. Richard, or Tandra or Carvel, if you have expertise in this, where do you think are the gaps that we can most effectively work from the federal government to address that question?
Well, the biggest gap is the one that you alluded to before, and that is that many of the violations of the Fair Housing Act are not explicit. It's not because people explicitly say that they are violating the act. It's because they follow policies which seem to be race neutral, but which have what the lawyers call a disparate impact on African Americans. And this is what you were alluding about before, about the standards of proof needed to prove a Fair Housing Act violation. The Obama administration had a rule interpreting the Fair Housing Act to permit violations to be prosecuted if a policy was enacted which disadvantaged disproportionately African Americans, even though it didn't say it was a racial motive. Trump administration repealed that. The Biden administration proposes to re-examine and re-implement it, but it's got to be much stronger than even the Biden administration enacted. Let me give you an example that I wrote about once, and it's not a Chicago example, but it's true in Chicago as well. Last year or the year before, African Americans in Syracuse, New York, complained about the fact that the city of Syracuse hadn't done a property reassessment for 25 years.
Mm.
As they hadn't done a reassessment. Well, it wasn't a racial program. They were just lazy. It was easier to use the old property values than new ones. But in that intervening 25 years, property values in white neighborhoods increased at a far more rapid rate than property values in Black neighborhoods. The result was at the end of that 25-year period, white property values were much higher relative to their assessed values that were 25 years old than Black property values were relative to their assessed values. The result of that meant that African Americans were paying a much, much higher share of the costs of schools and fire departments and libraries and other things supported by property taxes that than whites were paying. Now, is this a violation of the Fair Housing Act? It should be. It has a disparate impact on African Americans. It reinforces segregation. But the city of Syracuse didn't say that we're not going to reassess property because we don't like Black families. So you need a rule that permits you to have to consider such a race-neutral policy on its face to be considered a violation of the Fair Housing Act. That's the most important reform we can impose. And let me say that this business about disproportionate property tax valuations, most of the studies about it, not this most recent one from Syracuse, but most of the studies about it are based in Chicago, where it's been a practice for a number of years to assess properties in Black neighborhoods at a much higher rate relative to their market values than in white neighborhoods. So African Americans in the Chicago area are paying a disproportionate share of the burden of schools and other public facilities. That's one example. I can give you another example. Most places in this country, like this meeting, I assume you told everybody it's being recorded if it is, because you need to get people's permission to record them. But in some places you don't need to do that. And one of them is New York State. And so a year and a half ago, a newspaper in New York State conducted what's called an audit program, an audit testing program, in which identically qualified African Americans and whites went to buy homes from realtors. And they wore hidden cameras, which is permitted in New York without telling the realtors that they were being filmed in these interactions. And the results were quite disturbing. They found a large share of realtors telling African Americans, you won't be happy in this neighborhood. Here's a neighborhood where you'll be happy in, meaning a Black neighborhood. And in other ways, steering African Americans away from white neighborhoods when they could afford to move to higher opportunity places and into Black neighborhoods. We have to assume that even though I guess you can't wear hidden cameras without telling people in Illinois, I don't know, can you? Do you have two-way consent?
We are a single party consent state, at least as it comes to recording telephone communications. I don't know if those apply to video communications as well.
All right, well, maybe you can do it in Illinois then too. But you have to assume that the same kind of ongoing violations of the Fair Housing Act by realtors are continuing. And I think that one of the ways that we should do better enforcement is we should be conducting these studies. Even if you can't use hidden cameras, you can certainly take notes when you return from these visits and report on the discriminatory practices that are being followed. The federal government does these kinds of matched pair studies every few years, but it never identifies the perpetrators. It just comes out with statistics. And one of the things that we should be doing is we should be doing matched pair testing, where Blacks and whites with identical financial records, job histories, savings, and so forth, go to the same real estate agents and are treated differently, or maybe not treated differently. But we ought to be doing those studies and then identifying the violators of fair housing practices, and lifting their licenses if necessary, in order to end this kind of discriminatory treatment. So that would be another thing we could do.
So we have,
Thank you, Richard. Oh,
I was gonna say, you've all been
I'm
so
sorry.
gracious with your time, and I know we're running near the end of our witching hour and a lot of questions left. I think we've got time for one, maybe two more questions if we're quick. And apologies to everybody, we won't get to all of them, but maybe pick the best out of the pile and we'll see what we can do.
well, I don't know if it's the best out of the pile, but it's related to what you just said, Richard, that Gary and several other people in the Q&A mentioned about a Black family having their home assessed, and just, you know, the example that you just gave us. But I'd like to make a statement and ask a question. I have been shamed in the Q&A for pointing out the racism was inherent in the comment that former President Trump made, and in the fear that he stoked in communities, middle-class white communities throughout our country, when he talked about, when he essentially rolled back enhancements to the Fair Housing Act that would lead to more diverse and inclusive communities. So I want to acknowledge that, because, you know, Rep. Caston, as you mentioned when we started this conversation, these are hard conversations to have, but these are necessary conversations to have. But one of the attendees mentioned in the Q&A, appreciating the discussion that we're having. And the person said, yes, you know, we can change policies, we can, you know, include remedies, but how do we change hearts? And I know that that's a big question, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, the conversations that we're having are hard, and they're deeply personal, and they're about a lot of complex things that we're not going to all get to tonight. But I appreciate you, Richard, and Rep. Caston, and your office and your team, and Carvel, for us having the courage to have conversations based on facts, not on feelings, based on policies that certainly people can go and research themselves. And so I appreciate having that opportunity. I think the larger issue that we can walk away from this is, and I think you said this, Richard, that we all have a part to play in righting the wrongs and addressing these issues that affect all of us, all of our communities, and that, as you said over and over this evening, that are unconstitutional. So I wanted to acknowledge that someone was not pleased with what I said, which actually represented more to me of what we're talking about, the very thing that we're talking about. So thank you for allowing me to do so.
Well, let me maybe just make two comments on that, and I thank you, Tandra, for calling the hard conversations. The first is, you know, to tie back to Richard, your completely justified criticism of me at the start for saying that school quality is independent from diversity. Back when I was first running, we did an event over at one of the high schools in Glen Ellen, and a question came to the students about diversity, and I said, you know, the reality of life in America, sadly, is that high school is probably the last time in your life when you are going to be surrounded by a true cross section of your community. Because when you get out of high school, you self-select into colleges that meet certain interests you have, certain financial resources you have, and that you should make the most of those high school moments, because it's the time when you will really understand your community. I mean, I think outside of that, churches provide that to some degree, but there's not a lot of places, religious institutions of all, I'm not trying to be limited to one faith, but we don't have a lot of places in our life where you become sort of intimately connected to people of all walks of life. And the high school that I went to, which was a majority African-American high school, and the whites in the high school were majority Jewish. There's things you gain, because when you're surrounded by people every day you break those barriers when you see them as people. And I don't mean to sound like this is an up with people moment. It's just the reality, right? If a Black person or a gay person or a trans person or a Muslim person is just someone you see on TV, that's very different than if it's your neighbor or your girlfriend or whatever, right? So try to engage. The second point, just to the more negative comment in the feed, I think I'm sure that some of the people listening are listening to what Richard had to say and hear that with great fear. Talking about reparations, talking about that sounds like a wealth transfer, doesn't it? And it sounds like if you're feeling pretty good right now, that sounds like something that's going to be setting you back. And what I'd encourage everybody to think about is try to take race out of this. Just imagine you're working for a company where a significant number of the people in the company are essentially being held back and are structured in ways that they can't reach their full potential. And imagine you're the CEO of that company. You'd sit there and say, you know what, for totally selfish reasons, I want everybody to be give me 110% every day. I don't want a bunch of these people to be giving me 80%. Maybe it's not because they're lazy. Maybe it's because I've actually put them in a scenario where they can't give me 100%. Right? So do this for selfish reasons, and think about every moment in our history, in those parts of our economy that we have desegregated. Is there anybody who thinks that the quality of the Major League Baseball is worse since Jackie Robinson broke the color line? He didn't get the job because he was Black. He got the job because he was better than everybody else.
Yes.
And so, try to embrace that we're the types of solutions that Richard recommends can be done for some moral reason, but they can also be done for totally selfish reasons. Because the reason why the U.S. has been so competitive against so many other countries is because we've been a place that, has given access, to women that don't exist in other countries, have given access to people of different religious faiths that don't exist in other countries. And we ain't perfect, but my goodness, let's aspire to that perfection, because we can improve. So thank you all. Thank you, Tandra. Thank you, Carvel. Thank you, Richard. I'm sure there's a ton more questions. Thank you, everybody who took the time to listen and maybe get a little uncomfortable, but I'm certainly smarter for having done it, and I appreciate you all giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rep. Caston. And Mr. Rothstein, thank you very much for your writings and your education that you've given to us tonight. Hope that we all will take an opportunity to digest what has been said tonight, and that we look at ourselves and ask, do I want to be a part of the solution or continue to remain a part of the problem? And I hope that those tonight have learned something and that we can all become better for this and make this country what our forefathers wrote it to be, but it can actually be, because this can be the greatest country that exists. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.